Okay, so according to the schedule, we have until 4:35 p.m. for questions and answers, which is almost 45 minutes. But if you don't use that time, we'll just push the schedule up. So don't feel obligated.
Thank you, Professor. Relevant to your second to last slide about the concept of pooled funding mechanisms for CME, I wonder if you had any thoughts on what's the appropriate degree of specificity that a funder might provide. Obviously, you know, they don't want to fund CME on products they don't sell. And relatedly, the tyranny of the second grant is the phrase that's sometimes used, the idea that whatever this pooled mechanism is will nonetheless become reliant on sort of serving the industry master. So those sorts of questions about how you might flesh that out. Sure. And if there's a reference article that you think or concept that best encapsulates the idea, it'd be useful.
Sure, I think that's a terrific question. And to talk about pooled funding mechanisms, it's purely hypothetical in CME, but we actually are using it in patient assistance programs. The Part D program, the Medicare coverage of outpatient prescription drugs. The way that benefit works is we're supposed to call it a coverage gap, but it's known as the donut hole. And so when patients pay a certain amount of money in a year, then they end up with this period until they've paid a lot more money where Medicare doesn't pay for their drugs. And the manufacturers have very generously stepped in and they volunteer, well, hey, we'll give you the drugs for free during that donut hole. And it's very self-interested because once the patient gets out of catastrophic coverage, once they get out of the donut hole, then they're in catastrophic coverage when the government pays a whole lot of money for those drugs. So it's in the drug company's interest to give them the drugs for free during the donut hole so that they'll stay customers when they hit catastrophic coverage. And we have several advisory opinions and 2 special advisory bulletins on this issue because the drug companies want to just pay for their drug. They just want to give the beneficiaries free drug of their product. And what we've been making them do is establish funds to pay for a whole class of drugs. And there actually is quite a bit, it's exactly what you're saying. The pushback is we want the categories to be as broad as possible, and the drug companies want the categories to be as narrow as possible. And so we've tried to flesh that out in these 2 special advisory bulletins that are available on our website. And we don't have, this is sort of an area of the law that's still in flux, and we don't have it clearly defined, what is too broad and what is too narrow. It's clearly too narrow if you just pay for your one drug, and we're not having any success getting the categories as broad as cancer or pulmonary disease. The drug companies aren't buying that. So it's somewhere in between. And, our reasoning is fleshed out in the special advisory bulletins. And then the advisory opinions don't have as broad reasoning because advisory opinions are just targeted to the requester. A drug company can write in, any stakeholder can write in and say, I have this arrangement I'm doing, or I have this arrangement I'm thinking about doing, and it might violate the anti-kickback statute, or it might violate the civil monetary penalty on inducements to beneficiaries. And I want your opinion either that it doesn't violate it, or that it does violate it, and you guys won't pursue an enforcement action. And we have a few opinions like that that we've given to drug companies who want to give free drugs to beneficiaries, where we say, yes, this is potentially a kickback or potentially a beneficiary inducement, but we're going to let you do it because we think that there are public policy reasons and we want the beneficiaries to get their drugs. And then we just try and put on a few restrictions to minimize the risk. So we would think that we would have the same reasoning that we're using on patient assistance programs for drug categories. We would have the same policies or the same principles would apply to pooled funding for continuing medical education. Did you want to?
With AAU. Julie, it strikes me that for a long time that OIG, and not just your OIG, but OIGs in general, sort of have an inherent institutional conflict of interest in that OIGs wouldn't exist if there wasn't a risk of individuals or institutions doing something wrong. And so it's in some ways your own best interest to discover institutions or individuals maybe doing something wrong. And I think I bring this up in the context of something that you said, which I thought was excellent, the sort of black slide you showed with kind of the principles of what IRBs should be doing. And this references a comment that was made earlier as well as what Julie was talking about in terms of the regulatory compliance fabric of the research enterprise, which is that I think there is this real culture of compliance you hear about a lot from folks on the ground. And a lot of that, I think they would tell you, is driven by sort of kind of fear of OIG, I guess, or sort of perception of what OIG wants. And it kind of takes away from this broader culture that we kind of began the day talking about, where, how do we keep the sort of broader principles and mission of the institution at the forefront, rather than focusing on sort of the compliance, sort of losing sight of forest for the trees. So I guess my question to you is how can institutions or the research enterprise more broadly better partner with OIG to sort of focus on that, doing the right thing set of principles, as opposed to kind of this check the blocks, make sure we're not doing anything wrong in terms of compliance, culture, which I think is becoming more and more evident.
Yeah, and that's a concern, that we share. It terrifies people at OIG to think that we might be having a chilling effect on, beneficial research or patient care. And we have been trying to be better about proactively educating folks. It's heartbreaking to us. We will get, calls, or, we'll hear from folks that, people aren't doing free clinics or doing things because they're afraid of OIG enforcement. And we explain that, there's no beneficiary inducement. There's no kickback risk. If you want to provide services purely free from the goodness of your heart, that's terrific, and we encourage that. What we're trying to prevent is when a drug company is giving free drug, not because they want to give free drug, but because they want to sell product and they need to prime the pump. They need to give a little free so that the first one's free, and then you buy the rest. And we get calls from physicians all the time, who are trying to make arrangements with their hospital, and the hospital says, we can't give you this compensation that you want because of OIG, and then, the physician says, I'm going to quit, and that's going to leave the community without care. And it's actually not an OIG rule at all. The hospitals very often use us as an excuse. If it's an employee, there's no kickback risk. You can pay your employees whatever you want. And oftentimes people will say that they can't go forward with this care arrangement or this business arrangement because of OIG, and it actually really isn't an OIG issue. It's someone's using us as an excuse to say why they can't do something that they just don't want to do. So in terms of partnering with us, we are trying to be better about doing education. And then we do have, this advisory opinion process where we will allow arrangements that have some risk of violating the law, but where we feel that risk is outweighed by a real potential benefit to the community or to our beneficiaries.
And Kara, I would also say that it in large part is also dependent on the relationship of the agency with the IG. I mean, and we've had every variety of relationship with our IG, but in the end, we're working together towards a common cause. I would, though, mention the fact that, as I pointed out in my talk, what is that the idea of thinking about putting an apparatus in place for compliance, which is required if you put a regulation or a policy in place. Compliance under an institutional conflict of interest almost thinks that apparatus, I couldn't even envision what that would be. And perhaps with IG, but as the agency that would be responsible for the compliance of which you're having oversight of us, it's a little scary to think about what that might look like. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is such a difficult, complex issue to go forward on.
Okay, Terry?
Sally, I'm intrigued by what, at least to me, was a possible, an unexpected possible overlap between your observation, if I get it right, of the tentative efforts made within the federal government in general, but NIH in particular, to nudge grantees toward the adoption of guidelines concerning institutional conflicts of interest, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the theme that might be distilled from presentations of Jonathan and Hunter and Larry Lessig's contribution this morning, that there might be some value in the articulation by a consortium of universities of a set of best practices or something analogous. So I'm reminded, dangerously I suppose, of the relationship between the FCC and the film studios concerning the development of guidelines concerning whether material is appropriate for different audiences, where the posture of the federal government is to exert some pressure with a tacit promise or threat of regulatory intervention in the absence of voluntary action by the participants, which has been more or less successful in the entertainment industry in nudging the film studios and coming up with a system of their own. So the question then would be, I guess put a point on it, is it likely that NIH would be satisfied with the emergence of a articulation of a set of best practices by the universities and would not, under those conditions, feel any further desire to press forward with a regulatory initiative?
Well, certainly, we've, as David knows, and David's been on probably every effort that we've had in the area of institutional conflict of interest over the 7 or 8 years that I've been with NIH. I certainly think that the idea that this is born from the community is really important. I think that NIH does serve the role. We have the bully pulpit, we have the dollars, we can facilitate this. But because it goes so far beyond biomedical research into the fabric, as I said, of the whole university system, I think it's important that it be expanded. I certainly think that we could help facilitate that. The idea of having standardization or best practices that other institutions, as you saw from Julie's response, there were only, or her survey, there were only 70 out of 138 that had even policies on institutional conflicts of interest. I think that would behoove us all to think about this, and we're willing to help facilitate that. I think the point that it stops is going beyond that to have to set up either a policy, guidance, or regulation to manage this at the university level. But we certainly are here in the game with you. And I think it would be a great idea if we could come. And the universities have been doing it. We've had numerous occasions that we've been together talking about this issue over and over. And so I think you're suggesting the look is to us to see that this eventually comes to fruition.
Other questions? I'd like, before we take a break, I'm sorry, I apologize, please.
No, Patricia Bass, I work at a local hospital in Boston, and I have heard of the OIG because the first question we ask when we hear that is it the gun-carrying people or study people? So I'm very aware of that distinction. And which one? Oh, the study people, okay.
I have the gun.
So anyway, so my question is this. I recognize the second criteria that you were talking about in terms of looking at studies, because I'm also the IRB's lawyer as well, and we kind of call those the 40-20-11 criteria. But one of the things that we have discovered is when you want to bring those other issues into play, people say, why is that your business? And there is no, or do you think you're an NIH study section? So are there any suggestions about how IRBs can do that in a way that at least dovetails better with their ethical mission, because that's usually the pushback that happens with looking at that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's incredibly important to have support from your board of trustees, if you're a nonprofit, board of directors, if you're a for-profit. That's basically our position at OIG, is that, this top-down approach. When you have support from the leadership, and when we can hold the leadership accountable, that it's more likely that you'll be able to have the effect that you want, and that the researchers and the clinicians will respect your authority and listen to you and do what you're saying. And I know that's sort of cold comfort when you're saying to the IRB, well, get them to do what you say.
Well, I mean, it's actually in the law, but still, when you want to talk about it, why are you doing that instead of that? So I just noticed that. So people would like to do that, but there is a lot of resistance at the institutional level. And I can just say on a general note, I like forums like this because I am too often in the compliance world and do it because they get you if you don't, and thinking more about there's another overall reason that we do. And another thing that I'm surprised that didn't get mentioned today, because it is sort of an indirect regulation of financial conflict of interest, and that is if you are a tax-exempt organization, a lot of this stuff would be unrelated business income if you do it, and that hasn't been touched on at all, and that was somewhat surprising because that's the other curve.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Paolella. I'm a retired professional engineer and I live in Somerville. And I want to say that I have a particular bias, and that is that whenever money passes hands, there is an agenda associated with that transfer. I give you money, I want something back. I think it's hard to resist that reality. So, by the way, I specialize in oversimplifying. After age 70, now 75, I gave up specializing in overcomplicating to now oversimplifying. So, with regard to the responsibility to enforce the rules, the laws, in the particular case where I'm a happy beneficiary of Medicare for the last 10 years, and I give it a B+. I'm happy with it. But what I would like to know specifically, in your investigations and your oversight, how many of the investigations actually led to indictments?
I actually don't even know the answer, and I don't think it would be publicly available on our website. On our website, you can find out, who.
Well, give me a ballpark number.
I don't know what the percentages are.
Have any people been indicted?
Oh yeah, lots of people have been indicted.
Okay.
We have plenty of indictments.
Are we happy with that answer, by the way? Many people have been indicted. How many of the many have actually been convicted?
We have convicted a lot of people from all different professions. I mean, there are physicians in prison for False Claims Act.
Can
and
you
kickback
give us some
violations.
numbers?
I don't personally know the numbers. I mean, we could find them. Our website has the number of physicians who are excluded.
This is a tangent. If you want to accost her out in the break.
No.
But I'd like to ask if you please let it be till the break, please.
Pardon me?
Let it rest till the break, because I think it's tangential to what we're trying to do here today.
Well, I thought the symposium was to provide information.
And actually, I will say, Department of Justice puts out a press release every time we send someone to jail, so there's plenty of information publicly available out there.
The answers to the questions that you have.
Okay. Thank you.
Look, let me, before I thank our speakers, and we'll adjourn for a 20-minute break and then come back for the final session. I just want to make a comment. It seems to me that what we've heard today is, in many ways, anguish from institutional leaders who are aware of the obligations that they have to maintain the independence, authenticity, trustworthiness of their institutions in an environment that is increasingly pushing universities to create jobs and to translate research and partner more deeply with industry. The challenges that those mandates produce are significant, and I think that it's clear that everybody who has spoken or asked a question takes these things extremely seriously. Nobody is blowing it off. But I do think that, as I wrote in response to your ANPRM and your NPRM, and talked to you many times, Sally, I think it's premature to try to write a regulation for a set of issues that is so amorphous at this point in the minds of the leaders of institutions who would have to comply and make sure that the regulation was. What I would urge you to think about is promoting more conferences, gatherings, advisory meetings, or whatever, and pushing the issue. I don't think you should stop pushing the issue, but I think it would be good for the community and good for the government to keep exchanging information and listening to each other's perspectives in the hope that by doing that we could come to a mutually acceptable resolution of the problem. I don't think there's anybody in this room who would not like to see a happy resolution of whatever the government is concerned about, but I do think that it is still, it's sort of like a pot roast that's begun to cook, but it's not ready to eat yet. And I would hope you'd take home that message with you, all right? Not lack of concern.
I'm getting really hungry now.
Okay, 20-minute break.